And the recently re-elected Liberal government isn't planning to release a budget this year, opting instead for an economic statement later this fall. Typically, the budget is tabled in March or April and passed before the House rises in June. But a 2025 budget hasn't been put forward yet since Parliament was prorogued in January and the election campaign began in March. Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne told reporters after Wednesday's cabinet meeting that his number one priority is to pass legislation to implement a promised tax cut, which Carney has said will be in place by Canada Day.
The fiscal year has already begun. When are you going to have a framework for the public finances for the year?
Yeah, that's what I just said.
Shouldn't there be one as soon as possible in the fiscal year? You're going to leave it to the second half?
That's what I'm saying. So let's take it step by step. Canadians understand that.
I think we heard the steps.
No, but it's not very complicated. But why? Because it needs to go in a. Well, I would say because you need to go in a sequence that is logical. The first thing you do is the first step of this government is a middle class tax cut. That's the first thing. You start with that. Then you say, well, you need to have a throne speech to say what are the priorities of the government. And once you've done that, then you do an economic statement, which is going to be the fall economic statement. So this is the logical piece.
Year at this point, right?
Well,
we're just going to go forward without a budget.
Fall is fall, you know. I could not be clearer than that. Fall is fall. So fall 2025.
Last year fall was December. Last year fall was December. It could be nearly a year.
We're, you know, you will see with this government, and you've seen it with this prime minister, we're very clear. You know, that's why we say this morning there's 3 steps. It's very clearly outlined. And I would say Canadians have seen the priorities that we have outlined during the campaign. Priorities are not going to be different. You know, we provided a frame during the campaign. We said, you know, we need to fight for Canadians. So we're going to be there to protect Canadians and industry with respect to U.S. tariff. We're going to protect workers and industry, and we're going to build this country. So the frame remains the same, and in the building of the country, we need to invest in defense.
Is that why no budget this year?
We invest in infrastructure, and we're going to invest in housing.
We're now joined by our correspondent, Wyatt Sharpe, to discuss the implications of the federal government not releasing a fiscal budget. Wyatt, thank you so much for the time today.
Thank you so much.
Now, can you explain why the government is opting for an economic statement instead of a full budget this year?
Yeah, I mean, there certainly could be a number of reasons, but it does strike me as a little bit odd. Usually governments want to kind of present a budget at the earliest opportunity that they can get to try and kind of showcase what their government is looking to do and kind of bring some new kind of voices and some new policy ideas to the table. Of course, a lot of people are kind of skeptical with respect to Mark Carney and François-Philippe Champagne because they were both part of the Justin Trudeau government, people saying maybe it's just kind of a continuation. But you know, one of the kind of logistical and perhaps policy reasons for why this is happening is that anytime there's a budget presented in the House of Commons, they don't only present the budget, but then what's called the Budget Implementation Act has to get passed by Parliament, and that sometimes can feel like a very bureaucratic process that can take months. Sometimes, you know, it doesn't end up even getting passed until the fall, which is when François-Philippe Champagne is saying the economic statement is going to be delivered. So again, the government is saying right now, we don't want to present a budget when in reality that budget might not be able to get enacted by the time we provide this fall economic statement. Now, I will also say, though, François-Philippe Champagne is saying that the middle class tax cut that they have proposed is still going to be implemented over the course of the next few weeks when Parliament resumes on May the 26th, despite not having kind of the budget as the structure for implementing that tax cut.
And historically, how unusual is it for a government not to release a budget, especially following an election?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty atypical. I mean, the only time governments really haven't presented a budget was over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic. And that was kind of because there was a lot of funding going out at all different times for a whole host of different segments of the populations and government agencies. And so kind of presenting a budget would have just provided more kind of government revenue on top of that. The deficit would have become even larger. Whereas, you know, this time is kind of the only time that I can think of, at least going back to like the 1960s, 1970s, where government just point blank said we're not going to be providing a budget without really providing a concrete reason for doing that. There have been some instances where budgets have been delayed due to various circumstances, but usually they do still end up getting presented at some point. Although, again, as I had pointed out, it seems as if right now we're just going to have to wait until the economic statement, which in effect is kind of like a mini budget. It just doesn't kind of come with as much bureaucratic kind of background and process of trying to get it passed.
What are the immediate implications of not having a formal budget for Canadians, especially for provinces, municipalities, and federal departments relying on funding clarity?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, to kind of break it down into three different components, if you look at federal departments, they can obviously face uncertainty specifically with respect to planning, executing programs without kind of those clear budget allocations in place. But there's also, as you pointed out, provinces and municipalities who rely on federal budgets to forecast kind of funding for healthcare infrastructure. I mean, the provinces get their healthcare transfers from the federal government. Healthcare is obviously in a dire state right now in all really of the 13 provinces and territories. So that could prove to be pretty detrimental. And then also, you know, a lot of credit agencies, investors in Canada, especially with these tariffs right now, a lot of investors are looking to Canada and they're wondering, you know, why would we want to invest in a place like Canada, who obviously where there is great economic uncertainty and there's no budget to kind of show how we're going to get out of that economic uncertainty. It certainly sends kind of a bad signal to some of these credit rating agencies, to various investors, which could ultimately affect Canada's financial reputation on the global stage as well.
And Finance Minister Champagne said that his top priority is passing the promised tax cut legislation, as you've already mentioned. But what does that tell us about the government's fiscal and political priorities right now?
To me, it kind of suggests that they're trying to be different than Justin Trudeau. Justin Trudeau didn't really prioritize tax cuts, with the exception of when he first came into office in 2015. So Mark Carney doing that, perhaps trying to suggest that he wants to send relief to people who have been taxed pretty hard over the course of, you know, the past 10 years under Prime Minister Trudeau. But really, I mean, it's a personal kind of income tax reduction that's going to look at helping 22 million middle-class citizens. That's the number that the government has been providing to reporters in recent days. And the government wants you to kind of believe that it is, you know, underscoring their commitment to reducing the financial burden on middle-income families and earners, and that it's going to help create economic growth. Their argument is that when we lower taxes and people are able to kind of contribute in more of a free market society, that's going to make it more likely that they want to go out, that they want to seek jobs, and that they want to contribute to our overall economy, which again, right now, especially with these tariffs, is not really in a great state.
Now, there's been a lot of talk about how Mark Carney signed the order in the same manner as President Trump signs executive orders. Can you walk us through what exactly Prime Minister Carney is signing, and how is it possible for a tax cut to be imposed without an act of Parliament?
Yeah, it's actually interesting you mentioned that, because Mark Carney did something similar when the carbon tax was repealed. And it kind of has to do with some of the legislative loopholes that people can follow. Really, these are purely symbolic. They're not things that are actually going to be enacted until Parliament votes on it. So the actual implementation of this tax cut does require an act in Parliament, and the government plans to introduce that necessary legislation following the policy kind of agenda speech from the throne, as it is known, which is going to take place on May the 27th. And again, you know, it doesn't actually force anything to happen. It doesn't actually create kind of what Mark Carney has done doesn't on its own provide the necessary kind of backing for this tax cut to move forward. Again, that requires an act of Parliament. But what it is doing is it's getting Mark Carney the headlines of saying, okay, we're going to implement this middle class tax cut. And then when it comes forward in the speech from the throne, that's kind of when it will actually go, and when people can actually vote on it in the House of Commons, of course, members of Parliament. And it's not really a policy idea that's going to see a whole lot of resentment from MPs from any party, really, certainly not from the Conservatives or the Bloc Québécois, the NDP is a bit of a wild card at this point, but certainly there's a lot to watch for, and we'll be following it all.
Well, Wyatt, thank you so much for the time today.
Thank you.